The Monstrance, Machen. Then it fell out in the sacring of the mass that right as the priest heaved up the host there came a beam redder than any rose and smote upon it, and then it was changed bodily into the shape and fashion of a child having his arms stretched forth, as he had been nailed upon the tree. Old romance. So far things were going very well indeed. The night was thick and black and cloudy, and the German force had come 3/4 of their way or more without an alarm. There was no challenge from the English lines, and indeed the English were being kept busy by a high shell fire on their front. This had been the German plan, and it was coming off admirably. Nobody thought that there was any danger on the left, and so the Prussians, writhing on their stomachs over the ploughed field, were drawing nearer and nearer to the wood. Once there they could establish themselves comfortably and securely during what remained of the night, and at dawn the English left would be hopelessly enfiladed and there would be another of those movements which people who really understand military matters call readjustments of our line. The noise made by the men creeping and crawling over the fields was drowned by the cannonade, from the English side as well as the German. On the English centre and right things were indeed very brisk. The big guns were thundering and shrieking and roaring, the machine guns were keeping up the very devil's racket, the flares and illuminating shells were as good as the Crystal Palace in the old days, as the soldiers said to one another. All this had been thought of and thought out on the other side. The German force was beautifully organized. The men who crept nearer and nearer to the wood carried quite a number of machine guns and bits on their backs, others of them had small bags full of sand, yet others big bags that were empty. When the wood was reached the sand from the small bags was to be emptied into the big bags, the machine gun parts were to be put together, the guns mounted behind the sandbag rode out, and then, as Major von Unzu pleasantly observed, the English pigs shall to jail fire quickly come. The Major was so well pleased with the way things had gone that he permitted himself a very low and guttural chuckle. In another 10 minutes success would be assured. He half turned his head round to whisper a caution about some detail of the sandbag business to the big Sergeant Major, Karl-Heinz, who was crawling just behind him. At that instant Karl-Heinz leapt into the air with a scream that rent through the night and through all the roaring of the artillery. He cried in a terrible voice, "The glory of the Lord!" and plunged and pitched forward, stone dead. They said that his face as he stood up there and cried aloud was as if it had been seen through a sheet of flame. They were 1 or 2 out of the few who got back to the German lines. Most of the Prussians stayed in the ploughed field. Karl-Heinz's scream had frozen the blood of the English soldiers, but it had also ruined the Major's plans. He and his men, caught all unready, clumsy with the burdens that they carried, were shot to pieces. Hardly a score of them returned. The rest of the force were attended to by an English burying party. According to custom the dead men were searched before they were buried, and some singular relics of the campaign were found upon them, but nothing so singular as Karl-Heinz's diary. He had been keeping it for some time. It began with entries about bread and sausage and the ordinary incidents of the trenches. Here and there Karl wrote about an old grandfather, and a big china pipe, and pine woods and roast goose. Then the diarist seemed to get fidgety about his health. Thus, April 17th. Annoyed for some days by murmuring sounds in my head. I trust I shall not become deaf, like my departed Uncle Christopher. April 20th. The noise in my head grows worse, it is a humming sound. It distracts me. Twice I have failed to hear the captain and have been reprimanded. April 22nd. So bad is my head that I go to see the doctor. He speaks of tinnitus, and gives me an inhaling apparatus that shall reach, he says, the middle ear. April 25th. The apparatus is of no use. The sound is now becoming like the booming of a great church bell. It reminds me of the bell at Street Lambert on that terrible day of last August. April 26th. I could swear that it is the bell of Street Lambert that I hear all the time. They rang it as the procession came out of the church. The man's writing, at first firm enough, begins to straggle unevenly over the page at this point. The entries show that he became convinced that he heard the bell of Street Lambert's church ringing, though, as he knew better than most men, there had been no bell and no church at Street Lambert's since the summer of 1914. There was no village either, the whole place was a rubbish heap. Then the unfortunate Karl-Heinz was beset with other troubles. May 2nd. I fear I am becoming ill. Today Joseph Klist, who was next to me in the trench, asked me why I jerked my head to the right so constantly. I told him to hold his tongue, but this shows that I am noticed. I keep fancying that there is something white just beyond the range of my sight on the right hand. May 3rd. This whiteness is now quite clear, and in front of me. All this day it has slowly passed before me. I asked Joseph Klist if he saw a piece of newspaper just beyond the trench. He stared at me solemnly. He is a stupid fool and said, "There is no paper." May 4th. It looks like a white robe. There was a strong smell of incense today in the trench. No one seemed to notice it. There is decidedly a white robe, and I think I can see feet passing very slowly before me at this moment while I write. There is no space here for continuous extracts from Karl-Heinz's diary. But to condense with severity, it would seem that he slowly gathered about himself a complete set of sensory hallucinations. First the auditory hallucination of the sound of a bell, which the doctor called tinnitus. Then a patch of white growing into a white robe, then the smell of incense. At last he lived in two worlds. He saw his trench, and the level before it, and the English lines. He talked with his comrades and obeyed orders, though with a certain difficulty, but he also heard the deep boom of street lamparts bell, and saw continually advancing towards him a white procession of little children, led by a boy who was swinging a censer. There is one extraordinary entry, but in August those children carried no lilies, now they have lilies in their hands. Why should they have lilies? It is interesting to note the transition over the borderline. After May 2nd there is no reference in the diary to bodily illness, with two notable exceptions. Up to and including that date the sergeant knows that he is suffering from illusions, after that he accepts his hallucinations as actualities. The man who cannot see what he sees and hear what he hears is a fool. So he writes, I ask who is singing Ave Maria Stella. That blockhead Friedrich Schumacher raises his crest and answers insolently that no one sings, since singing is strictly forbidden for the present. A few days before the disastrous night expedition the last figure in the procession appeared to those sick eyes. The old priest now comes in his golden robe, the two boys holding each side of it. He is looking just as he did when he died, save that when he walked in Street Lambert there was no shining round his head. But this is illusion and contrary to reason, since no one has a shining about his head. I must take some medicine. Note here that Karl-Heinz absolutely accepts the appearance of the martyred priest of Street Lambert as actual, while he thinks that the halo must be an illusion, and so he reverts again to his physical condition. The priest held up both his hands, the diary states, as if there was something between them. But there is a sort of cloud or dimness over this object, whatever it may be. My poor Aunt Kathy suffered much from her eyes in her old age. One can guess what the priest of Street Lambert carried in his hands when he and the little children went out into the hot sunlight to implore mercy, while the great resounding bell of Street Lambert boomed over the plain. Karl-Heinz knew what happened then. They said that it was he who killed the old priest and helped to crucify the little child against the church door. The baby was only 3 years old. He died calling piteously for Mummy and Daddy, and those who will may guess what Karl-Heinz saw when the mist cleared from before the monstrance in the priest's hands. Then he shrieked and died.